Hello. This is the second lecture on political parties, and this lecture in particular is talking about how political parties conduct campaigns. And as a start to sort of thinking about this, I'd like to begin by sort of talking about why have political parties in the first place. This is a very real question if you want to think about it for a moment. I mean, why not just have everybody campaign as an individual? Since what we're doing in reality is voting for individual people to go represent us in Congress, in the Senate, in the presidency, in local offices and so on, why not just have everyone campaign as an individual? Well, the answer to that is that at the end of the day, if you were just sitting somewhere, you wouldn't necessarily know which people supported which issues without a party affiliation. How would the people, who lived, especially if you want to think frontier times, who lived a very far distance away, how would you have a sense of who should vote for? You should vote for. There is an advantage. I don't know how many of you have moved from one congressional district to another in your lifetime. I've lived in something like 5 or 6 different states at this point. And there was a sense that I discovered as I was moving from one state or another and transferring my voter registration that there are certain things that I could take for granted, that no matter where I was living, the same two political parties would probably stand for slightly similar stances on the same issues. That said, it's important to realize that parties are not particularly strong in the United States. This may sound a little bit strange because I talked about how we've had the same two political parties for 200 years, but we have what is known as candidate-centered elections, not party-centered elections. And much as I'm trying to focus on the American system for this class, at least for tests, I want to give you sort of a contrast. In Europe, they have very strong party-centered elections. And what that means is that, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter who you vote for, because every single candidate of a political party is going to toe the party line, and that the idea that an individual candidate would vote different than the party is incredibly rare, and is usually grounds for getting that person booted out of the party. Interestingly enough, in those places, and I've visited a number of them, when you look at campaign ads, the campaign ads also look different. You will see sort of, vote for the Green Party on election day, as opposed to vote for candidate Jones on election day. In the United States, we have candidate-centered elections, which means that all the campaign advertisement you see is generally for various candidates. And I can't even remember the last time I saw an actual party ad. There are lots of ads that are put out by parties on behalf of candidates, but they're on behalf of individual candidates, not parties. And I say this in part because, for example, it's not uncommon to find in the United States candidates who differ from their party on rather crucial issues. And I will give you one rather interesting one as a good example. And the interesting example I will come up with is abortion. Traditionally and by and large, Democrats have supported, as they like to phrase it, a woman's right to choose. Republicans, by and large, have been what they call pro-life. That said, if you were to look across the country today, it would not be too hard to find a Republican who was pro-choice or a Democrat who was pro-life. And this is possible because we have candidate-centered elections, not party-centered elections. And so there's not a whole lot of consequence for someone bucking the parties. In this case, then, the very real question is, well, what do parties do? Why have them in the first place? Parties serve to do 4 key things. First, they recruit candidates. Secondly, they raise campaign funds. Third, they develop policy positions. And fourth, they canvass for votes. So, how did this work? How does this work? Let's start with how it used to work. In the 1950s, parties were probably arguably fairly effective in doing this in a very sort of what we would consider sort of old-fashioned or folksy way. Parties were huge, had lots of volunteers, and had lots of sort of informal cocktail parties or events at clubs. You know, they would go to the Knights of Columbus, they would go to the Elks, and they would have little sort of get-togethers and parties and dinners and so on where they would meet other party members. People would volunteer for a political party, and candidates would work up through the informal networks and the personal contacts that they got through these informal gatherings, through this volunteering. And this was how people were recruited. At the same time, you had, because of this system, a limited number of people who knew a lot about the individual candidate. You know, the people who were in the upper echelons of the party knew a lot about this person, got to know them, made it their job to know all about them and what their strengths and weaknesses were. But by and large, individuals just sort of sitting there at a fundraiser didn't know a lot. In addition, there were sort of limited funds, and they were all sort of channeled through the political party. And because of that, there were limited ads, and they were mostly controlled by the political party. People worked their way up the ladder. So you would start off as, you know, representing on the school board, and you would get somebody's interest in the party, and then they would say, well, hey, why don't you run for this particular, you know, town council or something like that. If they were good in the town council, they would maybe run for state senate and so on, and work their way up through the system as long as they showed their loyalty to the party and they showed their effectiveness in winning campaigns. The longer you worked your way up the ladder, the more support you got from the party, and people with patronage would help you get out more votes. At this point, canvassing and getting out the votes was also more personalized. You needed a ton of party volunteers who would go and literally knock on doors. And they did this. This was the way that campaigns were run. People would go knock on doors, get out the vote, talk to people about the candidates, and so on. Because of limited funds and because there were a lot more volunteers than there was money, people relied a lot more on this personal contact and also on these informal get-togethers at dinners and things like that, rather than on large-scale advertising in newspapers or on television. So what's changed in the intervening 60 years? Well, two things. First, a lot more people work and or are devoted to family, and you have a lot less volunteers. And moreover, you have a lot better communication methods. And so what parties do now is very different. For example, while parties have always raised money, today fundraising is done a lot more by mail or by direct phone calls to select donors who can make a lot more contributions. Today there are complex computer databases that do everything, including databases that maintain lists of volunteers, voting tendencies, and this means that somewhere there is a computer that can sort of target what a person says is important and target, their fundraising appeal to that. This was, the idea of a direct mail campaign to raise funds for a political party was absolutely, it was a brand new idea in the late 70s. No one had ever thought to do it before, and by now it is perfectly common. In addition, and this is a change within the last 5 years, internet fundraising has become huge and has actually sort of altered the balance a little bit. Prior to the campaign of President Obama, what you saw increasingly was political parties going to people who had a lot of money and asking them to contribute the maximum, and then asking them to sort of get their friends to contribute the maximum, and so on. Thanks to the internet and to a couple of innovators on the internet, now people are, or at least the Democrats in particular, are getting very good at asking lots and lots of people to contribute a small sum of money. So rather than getting 10 people to contribute the maximum, which is $2,000 each, in order to raise $20,000, the internet has allowed 2,000 people to contribute $10 each, which makes for a lot more grassroots effectiveness. That said, all of this effort on money has led to better staffing. And elections and candidates are now what's called packaged. People create sound bites. People go out, there are actual research groups in political parties that go out and do kind of like opinion surveys. I think some of you may have done like online market research and things like that, where they sort of ask you, well, do you like Coke better or Pepsi better? Do you think, do you prefer your colas to be sweet, or do you prefer them to taste some other way? The same thing is done nowadays with political candidates and the policies that they would try. So you will get, people will sort of do anonymous surveys on behalf of political parties saying, well, if we were going to change the Social Security system, would you rather have a higher wait another year before you could retire, or would you rather increase your contribution level until you retired? And based on what people said, these policies would get packaged in different ways. You get a lot more, because of money, you get a lot more press. You get a lot more sort of big campaign events that are covered by news media. You get a lot more mailings. You get a lot more advertising that's sent to your mail. And it's important to realize that on a lot of levels, you get what you pay for. When I was living in D.C., I had a friend who was considering working for a presidential campaign, and this was, good gracious, probably about a dozen years ago at this point. And so as part of sort of her deciding whether or not she wanted to work for this candidate or not, she met sort of the inner circle of that person's advisors. And she was talking to one advisor who was relatively new to a presidential campaign, and she tells this really funny story that every so often when she would meet a staffer, she would sort of sit there and think, oh, you're the reason why this went wrong, because she could sort of see, because the person was new, because the campaign was just getting off the ground and so they couldn't hire really high quality experienced help, she could sort of see the things that people were learning on the job. As a result of this, we've become somewhat bombarded with information about every single candidate rather than about who the political party supports. But it also means that on some level, people believe that they have more choice. That said, what's happened recently, and this is one of the things that we're going to talk about, I believe, in a discussion board, is to the extent to which political parties are still useful. I asked you all to read the recent Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, and I asked you all to read it in part, well, for two reasons. One, because a lot of people have sort of made a lot about this decision in the press and in the media, and for that matter, in public interest groups and in protests and demonstrations. But so I always figure if people are going to make a big deal about it, it's important that people know what it is. But also because the reason why people make a big deal about it is they say it marks a huge shift in how elections will happen. Those of you who've read, and I hope all of you have read the Citizens United decision, will note that it is a recent decision. And what it does is it opens up some people have argued the can of worms, trying to think of a better metaphor and can't, but it opens up the ability to make political speeches to everybody regardless of who they are. More significantly, it does not limit how much they do. As I said, traditionally, people are limited in how much they're allowed to contribute to any campaign. So as individuals, each of us is allowed to contribute a maximum of $2,000 to any single political candidate. If there's some guy that you really like that you want to vote for, want to be on the school board, you can contribute $2,000 to that person. If there's someone that you really want to be a president, you can contribute $2,000 to that person. No, you cannot contribute any more than that. In recent years, starting about 10 years ago, we've started to see a whole lot of advertising that is not run by campaigns and is not run by political parties, but rather by third-party interest groups not officially tied to either the campaign or the party, but who campaign on their behalf. This is part of the reason why, and this is also the result of the Supreme Court decision. If you've watched a political ad for a campaign ad recently, at the beginning or the end of it, you will hear the candidate usually come on in his or her own voice and say, "Hi, this is, the candidate, and I support this ad." The reason why they have to do this is because in recent years there have been a ton of things that look like campaign ads but are not actually officially part of the campaign. They're not coordinated with the candidates, and they actually, by and large, tend to be a lot more negative than advertising done by the candidates. You get a lot of advertising in general that sort of talks about the worst case scenario if one candidate wins, and then encourages people to vote not against that candidate. Therefore, basically implicitly being an ad in support of the opposition candidate, although they're not allowed to say so. These kinds of advertisements are also required to sort of say who funded these ads at the end. So you'll say something like, this ad was supported by the Citizens for a Better Society or some other group name. This is an interest group ad. In years past, the ability of these groups to sort of put ads out has been severely limited. The Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court effectively eliminates the cap on this type of stuff. The reason it's controversial and the reason why people are somewhat upset about it is because, well, in the grand scheme of things, and I may be making unfair assumptions right now, my guess is that you don't have $1 million to run a presidential campaign, to run ads to influence a presidential campaign. I know I don't. I don't think I even have enough money to buy one ad for a presidential campaign. The people who have a lot of money for these things tend to be corporations or big industrialists or other things. And people have sort of argued about whether or not a true democracy would be one in which one side is so able to influence public debate by buying up so much advertising. If you are, watching TV one night and, there's 3 commercial breaks and each commercial break has 4 ads on it, and okay, one of them is for a soft drink and one of them is for beer and one of them is for a department store, and the other 9 are campaign ads. If 8 of those are in favor of one candidate because a major corporation is able to sort of buy all the advertising, and only one of them is for the opposition candidate, does that unfairly influence the political debate or not? And has that weakened the political party system at all? Have we now moved to a time when we really don't need the political parties for their ability to sort of find candidates and raise money and pass out information and develop policy positions and canvass votes? Have we now moved to an era where the money is out there in the hands of these groups who can choose which candidates to support based on the policies that they want to see moving forward? That is the big unknown. And like I said, the Citizens United decision is a new decision, and so we don't know. This is the first election campaign cycle that will happen since the Citizens United decision. We will see what happens. But I encourage you in the coming months to keep your eyes open for these different kinds of political ads and to sort of think about what their effect is. That's all I have. Our next lecture will talk about interest groups. And as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Have a good day. Bye-bye.